You've had a day at work where something went wrong and nobody saw. Not the wrong kind of wrong, not the kind that gets you fired or sued, just the kind where the thing that needed doing was harder than anyone realized, and you did it anyway, and then went home, and the people in your life asked how your day was, and you said fine, because the explanation would have been longer than the day deserved. Most working lives have a few of those days. Some lives have a lot of them. Almost none of them get recorded, not in any way that lasts. There's a story tonight where one of those days was written down. The day was Monday, the 10th of July, 1665. The place was Westminster. Not the Westminster of Parliament and Abbeys exactly, though the Abbey was a few hundred yards away, but the Westminster behind it, the streets called Sanctuary and Thieving Lane and Tothill, where the city's poorest crowded into wooden houses that leaned over each other like old people sharing a bench. The woman was Margery Stiffany. We know almost nothing about her. We don't know her age or whether she had children or where she was born. We know the church she belonged to, because the church wrote her name in a ledger, and the ledger has survived. The plague had come back to London that spring. It had been a quiet spring by the standards of plague years. A few cases in the parish of St Giles in the Fields, on the city's northwestern edge, in the kind of slum nobody official wanted to look at. By April, the cases had crossed into the city proper. By June, they were everywhere, and the rich had started to leave, in carriages stacked with belongings, on roads that grew more crowded by the week as people who could afford to flee found their way out. The king left in July. Parliament had already been adjourned and was sitting in Oxford. Most of the physicians of London had gone with the people who could pay them. Margery Stiffany did not leave. She did not leave because she could not leave. She lived on parish relief, the small weekly stipend the church paid to its poorest members. And parish relief did not travel. To leave the parish meant to lose what kept her alive. So she stayed. And when, in May or June of that summer, the parish realized it would need someone to enter the houses where the plague had got in, someone to bring water and bread to the people locked inside their own doors with their dying neighbours, Margery Stiffany said yes. The job was called nurse-keeping. It paid 5p a week, plus a small fee for each body cared for. By every contemporary account, it was the worst paid and most dangerous work in the city. The women who took it were called many things by the people who watched them from a safe distance. Off-scouring of the city, one pamphlet wrote that summer, "Dirty, ugly, and unwholesome hags," said another. Samuel Pepys, in his diary, called them thieves. He was wrong. We know he was wrong because of the ledger. The St. Margaret's Westminster churchwarden's accounts for 1665, a thick leather-bound book the parish kept separately that year, just for plague expenses, survived. It is held now in the Westminster City Archives. A historian named Lara Thorpe at Royal Holloway in London spent years reading it. She found 414 names of men and women paid for nursing the plague-stricken in that one parish alone. She found that almost all of them appear once or twice and disappear, the way most of the names in plague year records disappear. And she found one name that appeared more times than that, 7 to be exact, with a phrase next to it that none of the other names received. Margery Stiffany, paid for her extraordinary pains in looking after the visited. That was the entry for the 10th of July. The visited, in the parish's bookkeeping, meant the people whose houses had been shut up and crossed in red, the ones who had the plague. Extraordinary pains. In a book mostly full of names and shillings, somebody, the churchwarden, on a Monday afternoon, in the middle of the worst summer of his working life, stopped and added a sentence. That Monday is what we're going to spend the night with. Where she was when the day began. what she did with the morning, who she went to see and what it cost her, and what it earned her, and why one churchwarden in the middle of a city full of dying people decided that this woman, of all the 414, was worth a sentence. Before we begin, if a channel like this one is the kind of thing you'd like to see more of, the subscribe button does more than almost anything else. And in the comments, I want to know one small thing. The day at work I described at the start, the one that nobody saw. When's the last time somebody did see one of yours? You don't have to give the details. I read the answers, and I think about them. Now, get comfortable. Margery's Monday has been waiting in a ledger for 360 years. It isn't in a hurry tonight. The hour before dawn in a 17th century city is harder to imagine than the hours that come after. We have prints of London at noon, and at sunset, and at the moment a fire breaks out. But the hour before the church bells start their morning rounds is mostly absent from the visual record, because nobody who could draw was awake to draw it. What we have instead are the indirect traces. We have the watchman's ledgers, kept by men who walked the parishes through the night, and were paid by the hour. We have the diaries of insomniacs and of people who got up early to travel. We have the records of the bakers who began their work in darkness, so that bread would be ready when the rest of the city woke. From these scattered sources, you can put together a fair picture of what Westminster looked like at 4 in the morning on the 10th of July, 1665. And the picture is quieter than you might expect, and also stranger. The streets were not quite empty. A baker on Tothill Street would have had his oven going by then, the back door open for the small relief of cooler air. A night watchman would be sitting on a stool at the corner of one of the larger lanes, or walking slowly between the houses he was paid to guard. There were more night watchmen that summer than there had been in any summer in living memory, because Westminster had taken the plague orders seriously, and the plague orders required a guard at every house where someone had been confirmed sick. The guard's job was simple. He kept the people inside from getting out, and he kept anyone other than the parish-approved nurses from getting in. He sat by the door, sometimes for 10 hours at a stretch, sometimes longer, and he watched. The pay was 12 pence a day, which was twice what a labourer earned in good times, and considerably less than the work was worth. By the second week of July, several of the watchmen on the parish payroll had themselves fallen ill, and the parish was having trouble replacing them. So the streets were quieter than they should have been, but they were not silent. They had the particular quality of a city where most of the rich have left, and most of the poor have stayed, which is to say they had a lot of small noises with no large ones. A baby crying through a thin wall, a handcart on cobbles somewhere far enough away that the wheels sounded almost like distant water, the cough of a man on a doorstep, and then the cough again, and then nothing. You could walk down Tothill Street that morning and see the doors. Not all of them were marked, not yet. The plague had been moving through the parish for about a month by then, and Westminster's worst weeks were still ahead of it. The truly catastrophic August was coming, and the worst September was coming after that. But in early July, the death toll for the parish was still measured in the dozens per week, rather than the hundreds. So most of the doors were ordinary doors, but every 20th one, or thereabouts, had a fresh red cross painted on it, about a foot long, with the words, "Lord, have mercy upon us," written underneath in whatever hand the parish painter happened to have. A guard sat in front of each marked door. Some of the guards were asleep, some of them weren't. Margery Stiffany lived in one of the houses on one of these streets. We don't know exactly which one. The parish ledger that records her pay does not record her address, because in 17th century English bookkeeping, you didn't need to write down where a person lived if everyone who would read the ledger already knew. She was on the parish roll. She had been on it long enough that her name needed no explanation. Somewhere in the small wooden houses behind Tothill Street, in the warren of yards and alleys that made up the cheaper end of the parish, Margery Stiffany was sleeping. She slept in a single room. We know this because the parish records of the period are thorough about the housing of pensioners. Not out of any tender concern for them, but because the parish wanted to know how much it could expect to pay for their burials when they died, and the size of the room mattered for the rent. A single room meant a single pensioner, which meant a particular line item on the budget. Her room would have had a fireplace, probably small. A bed, almost certainly a low wooden frame with a straw mattress. A stool, a table. A few earthenware bowls and a tin cup. A blanket. If she had any books, which is unlikely, they would have been very small and devotional. There was a candle on the table, mostly unburned, because tallow candles were expensive enough that you used them only when you had to. Beside the door, there was a stick. It was a piece of plain wood, about 2.5 feet long, with no carving and no ornament, painted white. The white had probably come from a small pot of cheap lime wash, applied at some point in the last few weeks, and the white was already chipping where her hand had gripped it. The stick was the legal requirement. The law had been on the books for 91 years by then, since 1574, and by the summer of 1665 it was being enforced more strictly than it had been in any plague year before. If you were a person who entered the houses of the sick, a searcher of the dead, a parish-appointed nurse, an apothecary with patients on the inside, you were required, when you went outside, to carry a white stick at least 2 feet long, held visibly. The stick told other people what you did for a living. It was a warning in the same way the bells of medieval lepers had been warnings, and people were expected to step back when they saw one coming. There is something to pause over here because the law sounds quaint at first, and is actually one of the more advanced public health interventions of the 17th century. The plague, for reasons no one in 1665 understood, did seem to spread through proximity. A person who had been in a sick house and come out of it carried something. What exactly, the doctors of the time argued about endlessly. But the empirical fact was clear enough that the law could be written in plain language without anyone disputing the underlying reasoning. The stick was the visible signal. If you were a baker on Tothill Street and Margery Stiffany walked past your shop with her stick visible, you stepped to the other side of the road. You did not greet her. Possibly you did not look at her. You let her pass. And then you went back to your bread. Modern English speakers have a phrase for this kind of arrangement. We call it social distancing, and we treat it as an invention of the spring of 2020, which is a flattering thing for a contemporary culture to believe, and is also wrong. The mechanics had been worked out in early modern England roughly a century before the second cousin of the plague reached London for what would be its last great visitation. By July of 1665, the white stick rule was a piece of municipal infrastructure, as routine as the church bells. Margery's stick rested against the wall beside her door, because she had brought it inside the previous evening and propped it there before she ate, and now it was waiting for the morning. She herself was still asleep. Outside, a mile to the east, somebody was unloading a small cart at the river. A night watchman 2 streets over was eating something out of a cloth. Bread, probably, with a little cheese. The St. Margaret's bell, which would mark the start of the parish's working day at 5, had not yet rung. The sky over Westminster was beginning to lighten, but only just, and only at the eastern edge. It was early enough that you could still hear the rats. The reason we can talk about Margery Stiffany at all, 360 years after the morning she was sleeping through, has to do with a peculiar accident of 17th century parish bookkeeping and a particular doctoral student at Royal Holloway, University of London, in roughly the years between 2013 and 2018.
The peculiarity of the bookkeeping is this. Most English parishes in the 1660s kept a single set of churchwarden's accounts, into which all the parish's expenses were written in chronological order. The cost of a new altar cloth, the wage of the bell ringer, the relief paid to a widow with 3 children, the burial fees for a poor man who had died without family. A plague year changed that. When the plague arrived, the volume of work went up so quickly and so specifically that the regular accounts could not absorb it, and the parish was also obliged to keep a much closer record of who had been paid for what, because the money came partly from London-wide collections taken up at the King's order, and the auditors would later want to see where it had gone. So the parishes that took the work seriously, and St. Margaret's Westminster was one of them, opened a separate book for the year. The book was used only for plague-related expenses. It tracked the watchmen, the searchers of the dead, the nurses, the people who carted bodies, the people who bought lime for the burial pits, the people who provided food and small comforts to the households that had been shut up. It was a single thick ledger, leather-bound, with the entries written in a tight clerical hand by the churchwarden himself, or sometimes by a clerk if the churchwarden was busy. The book for 1665 survived. Many didn't. The Great Fire the next year took an enormous quantity of London's parish records, and various floods and fires and ordinary acts of carelessness took most of the rest in the centuries that followed. St. Margaret's was lucky, or organised, or both. Its plague book made it through. It is held now in the Westminster City Archives on St. Anne's Street, about a 15-minute walk from where Margery Stiffany was sleeping. The book contains, by Lara Thorpe's count, the names of 414 men and women who were paid by the parish for nursing the plague-stricken in the year 1665. Most of the names appear once. Some appear twice. A small number appear more often than that, and the smallest number of all, 22 women in the entire ledger, appear more than 3 times. Margery Stiffany's name appears 7 times. It is the highest count for any woman in the book. This is not, on its own, the kind of fact that gets a person remembered. Plenty of the names in plague year ledgers are higher counts than Stiffany's, because some parishes kept different bookkeeping conventions and recorded each weekly payment as a separate line, which inflates the total. What makes Margery Stiffany's name unusual is what is written next to one of those 7 lines. It is the entry for the 10th of July, the Monday we are walking through tonight. After her name, in a hand that is just slightly less clipped than the surrounding entries. Just a fraction more time spent on the letters. Just a small amount of ink released. Somebody wrote for her extraordinary pains in looking after the visited. That short clause is the only piece of personal commentary anywhere in the book. The other 413 names get a number, a date, and a category. Stiffany got a sentence. It is not a long sentence, and it is not a sentimental sentence, and the 17th century churchwarden who wrote it would probably have been surprised to learn that anyone in any later century would care about it. But it is the only one of its kind in the book. It is the only place in the ledger where the bookkeeper paused in his accounting and decided that something needed to be said about the person he was paying. That fact is what made Lara Thorpe stop reading at the same line, sometime in 2015 or so, and read it again and look up which woman it referred to, and begin to assemble what could be assembled about Margery Stiffany from the rest of the parish's records. What can be assembled is not very much. There is no surviving baptism record for her in St. Margaret's, which probably means she was not born in the parish. There is a marriage of a woman called Margery Stiffany, spelt slightly differently, which means nothing because parish clerks spelt everything however the sound landed, in the same parish in 1648. But the link to our Margery cannot be confirmed. There is no surviving will, which is unsurprising because she had nothing to leave. The 7 payment lines and the 1 sentence are essentially the entirety of her surviving traceable life. Everything else has to come from what we know about women like her, in parishes like hers, in the year that she lived through. Reasonable reconstruction, in other words, sitting on a very small foundation of fact. This is a thing worth being honest about, because the temptation in a story like this is to fill the silences with invention and pretend that the inventions are recovered facts. We are not going to do that. When we say that Margery had a single room, that is a reasonable inference from the parish accounts of pensioners' housing, and we will say so. When we say that she had a candle on her table, that is reasonable inference from the standard furnishings of poor London households recorded in probate inventories of the period, and we will say so. When we describe what happened inside the houses she walked into in the course of her work, we are reconstructing from the records of similar houses described by contemporaries, and we will say so. The 7 lines, the 1 phrase, and the date are the fixed points. Everything else is the work of reading carefully around them. The other thing worth being honest about is that for almost 300 years after Margery Stiffany's death, nobody read those lines at all. The book sat in parish storage, and then in archives, and then in the Westminster City Archives in its current form, and the entries were available to anyone who wanted to look at them, and almost nobody did. This is not unusual. Most of the records of most of the people who have ever lived sit unread in archives for centuries. The reading is what brings the lives forward into our time. The reading is the whole work of this kind of history. And so the line is read. The line is read by a doctoral student writing a 688-page thesis on the medical responses to the plague of 1665, who notices the unusual phrase and puts Stiffany into one of the chapters and then later into a journal article. The line is read by a reviewer of that article in a journal indexed by JSTOR. The line is read tonight in a quiet voice somewhere, and Margery Stiffany, who could not have known that any of this would ever happen, is for a moment in the same room with you. The morning, meanwhile, is happening to her. The bell at St. Margaret's is about to ring.
The St. Margaret's bell rang at 5, and Margery Stiffany was awake before the first stroke finished, in the way that working people who depend on a bell to mark their hours are usually awake a few minutes before the bell sounds, having trained themselves over years to anticipate it. She lit her candle. She got dressed in the dark, more or less, the way you get dressed when the cost of candle wax is more than the comfort of seeing what you are doing. Linen shift first, the weight of it slightly damp from the warmth of the room. Then the wool gown, plain, unfashionable, the kind of gown a woman in her position would have owned for years and patched repeatedly. A linen apron over it, a cap to cover her hair, stockings of coarse wool, leather shoes that had been resoled at least once. There was bread on the table from the night before, and a small piece of cheese, and a cup of small beer. Small beer was the everyday drink for everyone in the city who could not trust the water, which was almost everyone. It was weak enough that it could be drunk all day without producing drunkenness, and the brewing process had killed whatever was in the water that would otherwise have made you sick. She would have eaten the bread without hurry. She had no reason to hurry. The work she was going to that morning was waiting for her, and would still be waiting whenever she arrived, because the people she was going to see were not going anywhere. Then she put on a wide cloth, almost a shawl, around her shoulders. She picked up the white stick from beside the door. She opened the door and stepped out into Westminster. The walk from the cluster of poor houses behind Tothill Street, where she lived, to the parts of the parish where most of her work had been concentrated that summer, was about half a mile if she went directly, and a little more if she took the route most people took, which curved south to avoid the worst of the morning traffic, around the great gate of the Abbey. She would have taken the longer route. People who carried white sticks were not popular in crowded places, and she had no reason to make her walk more difficult than it needed to be. The streets she passed through had names that, if you read them on a modern map of Westminster, looked like the leftovers of a different city, which is exactly what they are. Broad Sanctuary, the open square just west of the Abbey, took its name from the medieval right of sanctuary that had once protected anyone who fled into the Abbey precincts from the law. Little Sanctuary was the smaller version of the same, a few yards north. Thieving Lane, which ran along the Abbey's western wall, took its name from the constant low-grade criminal traffic that the sanctuary rite had attracted to the area for several centuries. The lane was the route by which suspected criminals had once been brought into the Abbey grounds for the protection that no other place in England could offer. The right of sanctuary had been formally abolished about 100 years before Margery was born, but the names had stayed, and the population the names referred to had also stayed, more or less, and the parish had inherited a permanent underclass of poor and semi-criminal residents who lived in the alleys and yards behind the great public buildings and worked, when work was available, at the lowest end of the city's economy. This was Margery's neighbourhood. The names were not metaphor. At 5 in the morning, the streets were still mostly empty, and the few people who were out were the people whose work began at that hour. The bakers, the watermen down at the river stairs, the milkwomen coming in from the small dairies on the south side of the river, a few cooks for the larger households that hadn't yet emptied for the country. Margery walked past them, and they registered the stick, and they moved. There is a thing to say here about how that movement worked, because it is one of the points where the gap between 1665 and the present narrows almost to nothing. We have a phrase in modern English for what Margery's stick announced. We call it social distancing. The first wide use of the phrase in English language news was in early 2020, in the early weeks of the pandemic that closed the world's offices and emptied its airports. And the phrase was treated at the time as something modern public health had invented. A clever new piece of language for a clever new piece of policy. The policy was not new. The mechanics had been worked out by English parishes more than a century before Margery walked down Tothill Street with her stick. The proximity rule, the visible warning, the expectation that the carrier of the warning would be given a wide path. These were the same in 1665 as they were in 2020, and they worked in both cases by exactly the same mechanism, which was that the people who saw the warning believed it. What did differ was the direction of protection. The white stick was not protecting Margery from the people on the street. It was telling the people on the street that Margery had been in the houses where the plague had got in, and that they should keep their distance from her. The protection ran outward, away from the carrier. A modern medical mask and the modern hospital-grade respirator run the opposite way. They protect the wearer and the people around the wearer in a system designed to keep contamination away from the worker. The 17th century arrangement was simpler. It marked the worker as the danger. Margery would not have thought of herself as a danger. She would have thought of herself as someone going to work, but she would have understood why the law required the stick, and she would have carried it without resentment. The plague was not abstract. She had seen what it did. She was on her way that morning to a house where it had already done it, and she would have known when she set out that there was a real chance she would catch it herself before the summer was over. The white stick was not punishment. It was an instrument that allowed her to walk through the city without being stoned, and it did its job. The smell got worse as she walked east. Tothill Street ran toward the open field that the parish used for plague burials, and although Margery's route would have curved south before she reached the field itself, the smell from the field carried in July, in the heat. The Tothill Fields burial pit had been opened that spring, when the regular churchyards started to fill, and by July it was already in heavy use. The pit was shallow. The lime that should have been laid over the bodies was being applied unevenly, because lime was expensive and the parish was watching every penny it spent. On a hot morning, the air around the field had a particular weight to it that did not lift even when you got a few hundred yards away. The bakers downwind kept their back doors closed, even when the heat inside the bakeries was almost unbearable, because the alternative was worse. Margery had walked through this for weeks by then. Whatever she felt about it had become routine. It had become routine for many people in the parish, in the way that most of the worst things in any era eventually become routine for the people who have to live near them, because the human capacity for ongoing horror is finite, and adaptation is one of the things human beings are best at. There was a guard at the corner of one of the smaller lanes, sitting on a low stool, his coat unbuttoned because of the heat. He nodded at her as she passed. She nodded back. The guards and the nurses worked the same parish hours, more or less, and they recognized each other. It was a small mercy, the recognition. The nurses' work was the kind of work that almost nobody would have done by choice, and almost nobody understood from outside. And the guards, who sat for 10 hours a day in front of doors behind which people were dying, were the closest thing she had to colleagues. They saw the same things. They saw each other. The house she was walking to was a narrow 3-story building on a side lane that ran south from Tothill Street. We do not know the exact address. The ledger does not record it, because the ledger only records that she was paid and not where she went. What can be said is that the house was somewhere in the parish, that it had been marked with a red cross some days earlier, that there was a guard outside it that morning, and that the guard had been told by the churchwarden that Margery Stiffany would be coming. She turned the last corner and saw the cross from a distance. She saw the guard register her, and she saw him stand up. She came up to the door and stopped and waited, with the white stick in her hand, while he did whatever the guards did before they let a nurse in. A short conversation, perhaps a look at the parish token she would have been given to carry, the unbarring of whatever piece of timber was holding the door from the outside. The whole exchange took less than a minute. Then the guard stepped aside and Margery Stiffany pushed the door inward and went in. The door, when it closed behind her, made the sound that wooden doors made in narrow 17th century houses when the air on one side of them was cooler than the air on the other. A small, soft thud, slightly suctioned, the sort of sound that suggests a house is more or less sealed, and that whatever is inside it is going to stay inside it. Margery stood for a moment in the entrance. Her eyes were adjusting. The shutters on the front windows had been pulled to from the inside days earlier, and the only light in the front room came through the gaps between the boards. The smell would have been the first thing. We have to talk about the smell because the records do, and to leave it out would be to soften something that was not soft. A house in which one or more people had been ill with the plague for several days in early July, with the shutters closed against what the period believed to be the contaminating influence of bad air, with no working drainage of any kind, with whatever food had been brought in beginning to spoil in the heat, and with the bedding of the sick unchanged because no one in the household was well enough to change it. A house like that had a smell that contemporaries described in writing and were unable to forget for the rest of their lives. John Allin, an unlicensed physician living in Southwark that summer, wrote to his friend in the country that the smell was like nothing that I can call to mind, and Allin had been treating sick people for years before the plague arrived. William Boghurst, an apothecary in St Giles in the Fields, wrote that the air in some houses he had visited was thick in a way that made it hard to take a breath without feeling as though one had taken something else in with it. Margery had been in houses like this many times by the morning of the 10th of July. She would have braced herself before she opened the door and braced herself again as she stepped in. And she would have known from long practice that the bracing did not really help, and that the only way through was to do the work and leave when the work was done. She set her white stick against the wall by the door, where it would not be in the way. She put down the small bag she had brought with her, bread, a piece of cheese wrapped in cloth, a small earthenware bottle of something the parish had given her for the household, possibly small beer, possibly a vinegar-based preparation that contemporaries believed had some power against contagion. She took off her shawl. She walked into the house. We do not know who she found there, the ledger does not say. What we know about households shut up in St. Margaret's that summer comes from the parish's other records. The burial registers, which name the dead, and the household relief lists, which sometimes name the survivors who needed support. And from those records you can sometimes work out who was in a particular house at a particular moment. For the house Margery entered that morning, we cannot. The connection between her 7 payments and any specific named family in the parish has not been drawn in any work of scholarship we have, and may never be drawable because the relevant cross-references were not preserved. What we can say, with some confidence, is what kind of household it was likely to have been. Small, poor, with at least one person actively dying, and at least one other person locked in with them, possibly a child, possibly an older relative, possibly both. The shut-up policy made no allowance for the healthy members of an infected household. If one person was sick, everyone in the building stayed in the building until everyone was either dead or recovered. The 40 days of quarantine were counted from the last death. In houses where the plague had got in completely, the 40 days were not the relevant clock. So Margery walked into a small front room with the shutters closed and the air thick, and she found the people the parish was paying her to find, and she did the work she was paid to do. The work, in the language of the contemporary handbooks, consisted of fetching, watching, and providing. She would have brought clean water if there was a well or pump nearby that the household had been cut off from. She would have brought food in the small quantities that the parish budgeted, and she would have left it where the people who were still well enough to eat could reach it. She would have helped to change the linen of the sick where there was clean linen, which often there was not. She would have emptied the chamber pot. She would have spoken to whoever was conscious enough to be spoken to. She would have stayed for as long as she had been instructed to stay, which, depending on the household and the day, might have been an hour or 2 or longer. This is the part of the story where most accounts of plague nursing slide into a kind of grim picture-making, and we are not going to do that. The reason is partly that the picture-making is unnecessary. A person who has read this far can imagine the room without our help. And partly that the picture-making, when it is done, almost always serves a purpose other than honesty. It tends to render the nurse as a figure rather than a person. The figure is heroic or pitiable or saintly or some combination of the three, and the figure absorbs the room. The actual woman who is doing actual work in an actual room gets lost behind it. Margery was not a figure. She was a working woman who had been hired to do a thing, and she was doing it. The room was hot and the smell was bad, and the people in the room were in trouble, and she had a list of things to attend to that she had attended to many times before, and she attended to them. If she had any feelings about what she was doing, and she would have because she was a person and the people in the room were her neighbours, those feelings were not separable from the work itself. The work was the form her feelings took. The work was what someone in her position did, in her city, in that summer, when she found herself in a room with a person who was dying. Here is the thing about plague nurses that almost no contemporary account gets right, and that the parish records make plain when you read them properly. The popular literature of 1665, the pamphlets that ran off the printing presses through the spring and summer, the diary entries of educated men like Pepys, the moralizing tracts that warned the city against its sins, described plague nurses as outsiders, as predators, as women who came into houses they did not belong in and stole from people whose deaths they may have hastened. The pamphlet I quoted earlier in the evening called them the off-scouring of the city. Pepys, in his diary, repeated the rumour that they were thieves. That picture of them, which has stayed in the popular imagination for centuries because it appears in the most read primary sources, is approximately the opposite of what the parish records show. The parish records show that plague nurses in St Margaret's and in the other London parishes whose plague accounts have been studied were almost always residents of the same parish as the people they were caring for. They were neighbours. They were women who had lived on the same streets, attended the same church, drawn water from the same pumps, gone to the same markets for years. The houses they walked into in the summer of 1665 were houses they had walked past 1,000 times before. The people inside the houses were people whose names they knew. Lara Thorpe's analysis of the St Margaret's accounts, alongside the parallel work that scholars like Jeremy Bolton and Margaret Pelling have done on London's broader system of parish nursing, makes the pattern unmistakable. The nurses were not strangers. They were the women the parish trusted to walk into the worst rooms in its territory because they were already woven into those streets. This is not a romantic claim. It does not improve the smell of the rooms, or shorten the deaths, or make the nurses' work less dangerous. It simply changes who they were. Margery Stiffany was not a stranger walking into a stranger's house to make money from a dying woman. She was a parishioner walking into the house of a family she probably knew by name, paid by a parish she had been part of for years, doing work that her neighbours needed done, in a building she had passed many times in less terrible summers. Whether she had liked the people in the house, whether they had liked her, whether they had argued over a debt or laughed at a wedding the year before, the ledger does not say, and we cannot recover. But the relationship was not anonymous. Plague nursing in 17th century London was, almost without exception, a form of neighbourhood labour performed by women on behalf of people they had known for most of their lives. This is something modern hospice workers would recognise more readily than modern hospital nurses. The shape of the relationship, the worker who arrives in the home of a dying person, who is not a member of the family but is not a stranger either, who has been chosen by some institutional hand to be the person who is in the room when it matters, is a shape that did not disappear when the plague did. It got formalised, it got professionalised, it got moved out of parish accounts and into other kinds of records. But the shape persisted, and the people who do the work today are doing a version of what Margery Stiffany was doing on the morning of the 10th of July, 1665, in a small house on a side lane, south of Tothill Street, in a parish whose churchwarden noticed her enough to write her one extra sentence. How long she stayed in the house, we do not know. The ledger does not record working hours. By the rough conventions of the period, a parish nurse making a daily visit would have stayed somewhere between an hour and 2, depending on what needed doing. By the same conventions, she would have made more than one visit a day in heavy weeks, walking from one shut-up house to another with the white stick visible, until she had seen all the families on the parish's list. The 10th of July was a heavy week. The plague had not yet reached the catastrophic levels of August and September, but it was rising fast enough that the parish was already struggling to find enough nurses to cover the work. It is reasonable to suppose that Margery had at least one more visit ahead of her after this one, and that this first visit, however long it took, was not the end of her morning. When she stepped back outside, after whatever time she had spent inside, the guard was sitting in the same position he had been in when she arrived. He looked up. She nodded. She picked up her white stick from where she had set it against the inside of the door and held it visibly again. The light by then would have shifted. The morning was older. Somewhere 2 streets away, a bell was ringing for the next of the day's offices at St Margaret's, and the parish, in its slow, institutional way, was moving toward the moment when the churchwarden would open his book. The vestry of St. Margaret's, Westminster, on the morning of the 10th of July, was a small room on the north side of the church, with a single window high enough on the wall that whoever wanted to read by it had to angle their work toward the light. There was a long oak table running most of the room's length, scarred by 2 centuries of use. There were 3 or 4 chairs. There was a chest in the corner with parish papers in it. There was a shelf with the standard parish books, the burial register, the baptism register, the marriage register. And there was, that summer, a 4th book sitting on the table that did not normally live on the table because it was being added to almost every day. The churchwarden was already at work when Margery arrived. He had been at work for an hour. His name in the records of the parish vestry for 1665 was George Wells, and he had held the office for 2 years by then. We know roughly what he looked like only in the sense that we know he was the kind of man who got elected churchwarden in a parish like St. Margaret's, a respectable tradesman, probably in his 40s or 50s, well off enough to give up paid working hours for the unpaid administrative ones, but not so well off that he had fled the parish when the plague arrived. The men who stayed were not the richest men in the parish, and the men who stayed and worked were rarer still. Wells stayed and worked. He had a quill in his hand and a small inkwell next to him, and the plague book open in front of him. He looked up when Margery came in, which is the kind of small fact we can be reasonably sure of even without a record of it, because that is what people do when someone enters a room they are working in. He would have recognized her. He had recognized her at least 6 times that summer already, by the records we do have, because he had been the one writing her name in the book each time. What followed was the 17th century equivalent of payroll, and it took roughly the form payrolls take in any era when paper, pens, and small denominations of cash are involved. The work being paid for had to be confirmed. The amount had to be calculated. The entry had to be written. The cash had to be counted out. The receiving party had to acknowledge the payment in whatever way the parish required acknowledgement, which in St. Margaret's that summer was usually a verbal confirmation rather than a signature, because most of the women being paid could not sign their names. The whole transaction took perhaps 3 minutes. Then the next person on the morning's list came in, and the process repeated. The amount Margery received that morning is one of the things we can pin down. The standard rate for parish nurses in London in the 1660s was 5 pence per week of attendance, with small per-visit fees added on top of the base rate when the parish was using nurses to cover multiple households. The total payment recorded against her name on the 10th of July was somewhere in that range, plus the small additional sum that the extraordinary pains phrase implied. A kind of 17th century bonus given when a parish wanted to recognise unusually heavy or unusually difficult work. The whole payment, in the cash she walked out of the vestry with that morning, came to something between 1 and 2 shillings. In modern purchasing power terms, it is almost meaningless to convert. In the terms that mattered to her, it was about a week's worth of bread, cheese, small beer, and the small pieces of fuel and rent that filled a working life at the bottom of the parish economy. This is the part of her life where the modern phrase that fits most precisely is gig work, and the fit is uncomfortable enough that it is worth slowing down for. Margery was paid by the body. That is the basic shape. The parish had a list of houses where the plague had got in, and the parish needed nurses to enter those houses, and the nurses were paid for each household they tended, plus a base rate that just barely covered the time they spent moving from house to house. There was no salary. There was no contract that ran beyond the current outbreak. There was no provision for what would happen if Margery herself fell sick. If she caught the plague, the parish would mark her with a cross and pay another woman at the same rate to bring her water and bread until she either recovered or died. If she died, the parish would pay the gravedigger from the same plague book that recorded her wages, and the entry would close. The arrangement was almost entirely transactional. It was also almost entirely necessary, because the alternative, a parish that did not pay its nurses and therefore could not staff the work, was a parish in which the sick would die alone, faster, and the contagion would spread further. In the present century, we have a name for the kind of work that is paid by the unit, that runs on the demand for a particular service, that carries no benefits and no protection beyond the next payment, that is performed disproportionately by women and by the poor. And that exists because the institutions that need the work done have decided not to absorb it as salaried labour. We call it gig work. The closest modern relative of Margery Stiffany is not a nurse, in the contemporary professional sense. Nurses today are salaried and licensed and protected, but a worker on a delivery platform or a shift caregiver in an under-regulated home care service, or one of the people who in the spring of 2020 wore a thin cloth mask and rode public transport across an empty city to clean the rooms in which patients were dying, because the hospitals had not yet figured out how to staff their cleaning rotations any other way. There is a difference, of course, and it is worth naming. Margery's parish did not see itself as exploiting her. The parish saw itself as fulfilling a responsibility. The old poor law of 1601 had assigned the relief of the parish poor to the parish itself, and the system, with its many flaws, was the only safety net the city had. Wells, sitting at the oak table in the vestry, was a man performing a duty he had taken on voluntarily in a system he believed in, paying out money that had been collected from his neighbours under a tax he himself was subject to. He was not the platform. He was a member of a small institution doing the only thing it could do to keep its weakest members alive in a year that was killing many of them. The 17th century arrangement was rougher than the modern one in many ways, and gentler than the modern one in a few. The parish, at its best, knew the people on its rolls. The platform does not. What the two arrangements share is the structure underneath. The work that costs the most, in risk and in difficulty, is paid the least. The people who do it have the fewest other options. The institutions that pay for it pay only for the work that gets done. And only at the moment the work is done, and the workers carry the weight of everything else themselves. That structure existed in 1665 and exists in the year this is being recorded, and it has existed in many of the centuries between, and the people in it have rarely been famous, and the entries in their ledgers have rarely been remarked. Wells wrote the entry on the 10th of July with the particular small care that the records suggest he gave it. He set down her name, he set down the amount, he set down the date, and then, for reasons we cannot fully recover, he set down the additional clause. For her extraordinary pains in looking after the visited. And the ink in his quill released a fraction more than it had on the surrounding lines, and the phrase stayed on the page, and it has been there ever since. He counted out the coins. She took them. She thanked him in whatever the thanking convention of a Westminster parish was. A nod, a brief word, a small gesture of the kind that doesn't need to be elaborate, when both parties already know what has happened and what will happen tomorrow and the day after that. She put the coins in the small purse she would have carried under her apron, where the weight of them would be felt against her hip on the walk home. She picked up her white stick from where she had set it against the wall by the vestry door. She stepped back into the morning, which by then was no longer morning in any useful sense, because the bells had moved past midday sometime earlier, and the heat had begun to settle over the parish in the heavy, patient way it settled over Westminster in July. The book stayed open on the table. Wells drew his quill back into the inkwell, wrote nothing for a moment, and then turned the page. If you had been able to stand on the lead roof of St. Margaret's that midday, looking out across the parish and the city beyond it, you would have seen a London that does not appear in any of the standard prints of the period, because the prints of London were almost all made either before 1665 or in the years afterward, when the painters had returned to a city whose population had returned with them. The city Margery walked back into when she stepped out of the vestry was not the city of the prince. It was something stranger. It was a great commercial capital with most of its commerce stopped, a great administrative capital with most of its administrators gone, a great social capital whose social rituals had been suspended one by one through the spring. The streets at noon should have been crowded. Most of them were not. The places that were full had filled in particular ways. The river, where it could still be worked, was being worked. The bakeries were open because everyone had to eat, and the parish had pressed the Lord Mayor to keep the ovens going both for the food and for the political reason of preventing food riots in a city where the food supply had become unreliable. The markets that were still operating had thinned, but not closed. There were stalls at Westminster's market that morning, fewer than there should have been but more than nothing, selling what the country roads had brought in and what the parish kitchens were buying in bulk for distribution to the households that had been shut up. The men working the stalls where they had not fled would have been cautious about who they spoke to and where they stood, because any rumour that a particular stallholder had handled goods from an infected house would empty his trade for the rest of the day. The places that should have been full and were now empty are the places that get described most often by the contemporary witnesses, and the descriptions converge. Pepys, in his diary, kept noticing the closures, and the noticing has a particular obsessive quality to it. The Angel Tavern at the lower end of Tower Hill, shut up. The ale house at the Tower Stairs, shut up. His favourite pubs along the river, one by one, marked or boarded or simply silent. The Royal Exchange, which in any normal week was the loudest place in the city, with merchants shouting bids in 3 languages and runners pushing through the crowd carrying paper, had thinned to almost nothing by July. The theatres had closed in May by royal proclamation. The cockpits and bear pits had closed with them, the bowling alleys, the dancing rooms, the ordinary social fabric of what had been one of the most densely entertained cities in Europe was, by the second week of July, largely gone. What replaced it in the streets that had emptied was a particular kind of attentive quiet. People who walked through London that summer wrote later that they could hear things they had never heard before. The rasp of a shoe on a paving stone 50 yards away, the conversation of 2 men through an open window, the particular small sound a horse made when it was not in a hurry. The quiet was not peaceful, it was alert. It was the quiet of a city in which everyone who remained was paying attention, because the cost of not paying attention was significant and immediate. You watched which doors had crosses on them. You watched which people on the street were carrying white sticks. You watched the faces of the people you passed for any sign that they were unwell. You watched the bells because the bells told you when someone in your parish had died, and the bells in July had begun ringing more often than they had at any time in living memory. The bells were the city's primary information system, and they ran in parallel with a paper one. Every Thursday afternoon, the parish clerks of London compiled their weekly counts of deaths, and the counts were printed up overnight in the form of a single broadsheet called the Bill of Mortality. And on Friday morning, the broadsheets were sold in the streets for a penny each. They listed the deaths in every parish within the city and the liberties, broken down by cause. They gave a total. They gave a comparison to the previous week. People bought them and read them with the particular intensity that human beings give to numbers when the numbers concern their own survival, and the Bill of Mortality in the summer of 1665 was probably the most widely read document in London. A useful way to think about the bills for anyone trying to imagine the texture of life in the city that summer is that they were the first widely distributed public health data feed in modern history. They had been in continuous publication since the earlier plague years of the 1620s and 1630s, but the 1665 bills were where the form came into its own. Londoners read them the way we now read the daily case counts of a current outbreak, with the same mixture of compulsive return and dread, the same trick of finding small reassurance in any week's lower number, the same quiet calculation of which neighbourhoods were getting worse. You could buy the broadsheet on Whitehall in the morning and follow the disease across your own city by parish. You could see Margery's parish among the columns. You could see by the second week of July that St Margaret's was beginning to climb. The bill that would be published on the Thursday of Margery's week, the 17th of July, would record for the parish of St Margaret's, Westminster alone, well over 100 plague deaths in the previous week. Across the whole city, the total would be measured in the low thousands. By the standards of August and September, it would seem almost mild. By the standards of any normal year, it was already catastrophic. The trajectory was visible in the numbers. The people reading them in the pubs that were still open and at the breakfast tables of the houses that were still occupied knew what the trajectory meant. And while Margery walked back from the vestry with her white stick visible and the small purse heavy under her apron, Samuel Pepys was at his office at the Navy Board. We can place him there with some precision, because the diary entry he wrote that night says where he was. He had been working through the morning on naval contracts. He had taken a short break for the small business of his Tangier accounts, and he had written a letter or two. He had also at some point in the day made a note in the diary about how empty the streets had been when he walked between two of his appointments. The streets were empty because the people who could afford to be elsewhere were elsewhere, and the people who could not afford to be elsewhere were either at work in places like the parish kitchens, or shut up in their houses with the disease, or moving through the city with white sticks visible. Pepys would have passed several women with white sticks on his walks that day. Whether any of them was Margery, we cannot know. The streets they shared, however, are now traceable in two records. His, which is famous, and hers, which is the ledger of a parish that paid her 7 times that summer for what one churchwarden took the trouble to call her extraordinary pains. Both records describe the same city on the same day from very different angles. Pepys's diary, even in the plague summer, is full of his small comforts and small ambitions. The meals he ate, the women he flirted with, the music he listened to, the increase in his personal fortune. The plague is in it, but the plague is one thing among many, and Pepys himself is by his own account having one of the happier years of his life. He would write at the close of the year that he had never lived so merrily. The ledger of St Margaret's is full of payments to nurses and gravediggers and watchmen, with no commentary except the one phrase about Margery, and the parish whose accounts those were did not have a happy year at all. Both documents are true. Neither is the whole picture. The picture, to the extent we can recover it, is somewhere in the space between them, in the streets they each walked on the same warm Monday in July, separated by a few hundred yards and by everything else. Margery walked west. The bells of the next parish over were just beginning to ring as she turned into the smaller lane she'd come up from, and the heat, by then, had settled into the kind of heaviness that does not lift before evening. She had one more visit to make before the day was done. The London printing trade had a busy summer in 1665. Plague years were good for the press in the perverse way that disasters are good for the press in any era. People were frightened, people had questions, people wanted explanations and remedies and prayers and sermons and theories about which sins of the city had brought the visitation upon it, and every one of those wants could be supplied for a few pence by a print shop. The presses ran. Pamphlets came off them in numbers. Most of the pamphlets were short, 8 pages, 16 pages, sometimes a single folded broadsheet. And most of them were cheap, and most of them sold quickly, because the audience for them was anyone in the city who could read and was anxious enough to want something to read. Many of the pamphlets that summer concerned the policy of shutting up infected houses. The policy was the most visible piece of plague-time public health, and it was also the most controversial. The houses where the plague had got in were nailed shut with everyone in them, including the people who had not yet caught it. The watchmen stood outside. The 40-day clock ran from the last death, which meant in many infected households that the clock kept resetting, and the surviving members of the household stayed sealed inside until they too died, or until some kind of clemency came from the parish, which was rare. The policy was defended by some and attacked by others, and the attacks made for the kind of vivid pamphlet copy that sold. One of the most read of the season was a pamphlet whose long title can be shortened by the convention of the period to "The Shutting Up of Infected Houses Soberly Debated." It appeared in the early summer. Its anonymous author argued that the policy was not just cruel but counterproductive, that confining the healthy with the sick simply ensured the spread of the disease within each shut-up household, that the parish authorities had got the medical reasoning wrong, and that the whole machinery of nailed doors and watchmen and parish-paid attendants was a system of state-sponsored death rather than state-sponsored protection. The argument was, by the standards of 17th century medical thinking, more or less correct. The shut-up policy did not prevent transmission within a household, and almost everybody who got the policy wrong, including the College of Physicians, eventually came to acknowledge that. The pamphlet's reasoning was sound. The author was making a serious case. The author was also, in the course of making that case, enthusiastic about a particular kind of villain. The villain was the parish-paid nurse. The pamphlet's portrayal of the nurses ran through several pages. The nurses, in this telling, were thieves. They were also drunks. They were also incompetents. They were also women whose presence in a household actively shortened the lives of the people they were supposed to be caring for, because they robbed the dying of their possessions and were careless with the linen and the food, and because they brought the contagion in from previous houses on their clothes. The pamphlet called them, in one of its sharper passages, the off-scouring of the city, which is a phrase that means roughly what it sounds like: the rinse water of London, the sediment that nothing else wanted. They were described as physically repellent, as old, as ugly, as deformed. The shut-up household, the pamphlet argued, was not just a death trap of contagion. It was a death trap of contagion supervised by a witch. The pamphlet was not a fringe document. It was widely read. It was reprinted. Its arguments turned up in other pamphlets and in sermons, and in the conversations of educated men over their dinners. And within a few weeks, it had helped to fix a particular picture of the plague nurse in the literate imagination of the city. The picture was vivid. The picture was repeated. The picture was, within the small set of documents that survived the centuries to be read by later historians, the dominant account of who the nurses had been. Samuel Pepys read it, or read something very like it, and the picture was confirmed for him. His diary mentions plague nurses only a few times, but each time the mention is hostile. He repeats the rumor about the thefts. He records, with a small note of approval, the suggestion that the nurses sometimes hastened the deaths of patients in order to get to their belongings sooner. Where Pepys got the rumor from, we can guess. His friend Nathaniel Hodges, the physician, had spent the spring and summer attending plague patients in some of the wealthier London parishes, and Hodges had his own reasons to be unhappy with the parish nurse system. The licensed doctors of the city resented the parish nurses for a complicated set of reasons that had to do with professional territory, with class, and with the medical establishment's discomfort at the fact that women without any formal training were, in the most dangerous houses in the city, doing more sustained patient care than the licensed doctors were. Hodges put his version into letters and into conversation, and the version travelled. So the picture of the nurses that has come down through the most read primary sources of the period is the picture that the pamphlets and the diaries and the educated correspondents painted. The picture is fixed. It is, for many readers who first encounter 1665 through Pepys, the only picture they ever get. The trouble is that the parish records say something else. The parish records have not been studied as much as the diaries, partly because there are far more of them, and they are far less entertaining, and partly because the names in them are mostly names of people who left no other trace. Reading them is slow work. The handwriting is dense, the abbreviations are local. The entries assume a knowledge of parish geography and parish society that the modern reader has to acquire. But a small number of historians have done the slow work, on the records of one parish at a time, and the picture that has emerged from the parish accounts is not the picture in the pamphlets. The picture in the parish accounts is of a system that worked, not perfectly and not cheaply, and not without grief, but functionally. The nurses on the parish rolls were, in most cases, women who had been on those rolls for years before the plague arrived. They were poor relief recipients, mostly older, mostly widowed, mostly already known to the parish overseers as people the parish was responsible for. When the plague made the nursing work necessary, the parish drew on the people it already had. The nurses walked into houses on streets they had walked all their adult lives. The patients in the houses were neighbours, often literal next-door neighbours, sometimes cousins, sometimes the parents of children the nurses had known from the local school or the parish charity. The relationship was not anonymous. The work was not predatory. The fee was small and was paid on time when it was paid, and the parish kept its records, and the records survived. Lara Thorpe, in the doctoral thesis at Royal Holloway, and in the chapter she published from it a year later, did the slow work for the records of St. Margaret's, Westminster. She read the 414 names, and she traced the ones that could be traced through the parish's other documents: the burial register, the relief lists, the marriage register, the rate books for the parts of the parish where the nurses were known to have lived. She found something the pamphlets had not. Almost all of the nurses in the St. Margaret's Plague Book had been parishioners of St. Margaret's for years. Many of them had been on the parish poor rolls before the plague arrived, drawing the small weekly payments that were the 17th century equivalent of welfare. Several had been recorded as nurses in earlier outbreaks before 1665, in the smaller plague years of the previous decade. They were not strangers to the work. They were not strangers to the parish. They were not strangers to the houses they walked into. And, a detail that matters more than it first sounds, most of them, across the whole season, only nursed a handful of patients each. The pamphlet picture of a roving predator working her way through the dying for profit assumes a worker moving from house to house at high volume. The records describe the opposite: women who took on a small number of households, often the same ones across weeks, and stayed with them. The accusation that ran through the pamphlets, that the nurses were predators from outside, drifting in to make a profit from death, described a category of person that, in St. Margaret's at least, did not seem to exist in the records at all. What the records do show, repeatedly and unambiguously, is the rate at which the nurses themselves died. The Plague Book of St. Margaret's records the deaths of its own employees as the year goes on. Some of the nurses paid in June do not appear in July. some of the nurses paid in July, do not appear in August. The parish, over the course of the summer, kept losing the women it had hired to do its most dangerous work. The losses are recorded matter-of-factly, in the same hand as the payments, in the same book. The women who survived the year were the exception. Margery Stiffany was one of them. The sentence about her, the small sentence the churchwarden added to the entry for the 10th of July, is, in this light, harder to read as routine and easier to read as a churchwarden's quiet acknowledgement that this woman, paid for the 7th time that year, was managing to keep doing the work in a season when most of her colleagues were not. There is a thing worth saying here because it is one of the persistent shapes that history takes and is therefore worth being honest about. The picture of the workers that the educated contemporaries of an event leave behind is, very often, not the same picture that the workers' own employers left behind in the day-to-day records. And the second picture is, very often, more accurate than the first. The first picture is the picture that gets remembered, because the first picture is the one written by people whose words were collected and republished and taught. The second picture stays in the archive. The second picture has to be read out slowly by someone who decides it is worth the trouble. The trouble has to be taken again and again by people willing to take it, or the second picture stays in the dark. This pattern has not gone away in 3.5 centuries. The workers who do the most dangerous work in a city under stress have not always, even in the present century, been described accurately by the people who wrote the most read accounts of the stress. The accounts that get repeated are sometimes the accounts that defame the workers, and the corrections, when the corrections come, often come from sources that are read less and travel less far. The shape of the misrepresentation is not new. It was old in 1665. It is old now. Margery Stiffany was, on the morning of the 10th of July, walking back through the parish toward another shut-up house with a small fee in her purse and a churchwarden sentence in a book she would never read. The pamphlets that were calling her a thief that summer were on sale a few hundred yards from her route. She would not have read those either. She got to the second house a little after 1. The lane it sat on was narrower than the one she had been in that morning and shaded for most of the day by the upper stories of the houses opposite, which leaned in toward each other in the way that wooden upper stories did all over London in those years, brought close enough at the top that a person standing in one window could pass an object across to a person standing in the other. The lane was cooler than the open streets. It also held the air longer, and the air on the lane that afternoon held the smell of the house she had come to visit, and of 2 other houses on the same lane that had also been marked. She stopped at the door. There was a guard on a stool, and she nodded at him, and he nodded back, but she did not yet hand over her parish token, because she was doing what she always did at the start of a second visit on a heavy day, which was to give herself a moment before she opened the door. There is no record of her doing this. There is also no record of any working person in any difficult job not doing it. The pause was hers and was not in the ledger. The cross on the door of this house was older than the cross on the door of the mornings. The red had faded. The paint had run a little where rain had hit it earlier in the week. "Lord, have mercy upon us" had been written underneath in the careful, slow hand of the parish painter, who did this work every day now and was not painting quickly. The household behind the door had been shut up for somewhere between 2 and 3 weeks. Margery had been visiting it for most of that time. We do not know the name of the family. We have to keep saying this because the whole shape of what the channel does depends on saying it. The ledger records that Margery was paid for nursing in a particular week, in a particular parish, at a particular rate. It does not record at which addresses she did her work, and it does not record the names of the people she nursed. The connection between her 7 payments and the burial register entries that name the dead of St. Margaret's that summer has not been drawn in any work of scholarship I have read, and may not be drawable from the surviving documents at all. So when I describe the household behind the second door, I am drawing on what we know about households of that station in that parish in that week, not on what we know about this household specifically. The reconstruction is reasonable. It is not recovered fact. What the reconstruction looks like is something like this. There were probably 4 or 5 people inside when the cross first went up. By the second week of July, there were probably fewer. One person had likely died already in the first days and had been carried out at night by the parish bearers. Another might have died since and might still be in the house, depending on what hour of the day or night the cart had last come past. The survivors, whoever they were people who had been in the building continuously for 2 or 3 weeks, with no permission to leave, with whatever food the parish could spare brought to the door by Margery and by the watchman, with the windows mostly shuttered, with no medical attention of any kind beyond what Margery herself could do. There were no doctors coming. There had not been doctors coming for weeks. By early October, Pepys would write in his diary the sentence about Westminster having no physician left, and 1 apothecary, and his observation was already true in July of the parish where Margery worked. The licensed medical practitioners of the city had, with a small number of exceptions like William Boghurst over in St Giles in the Fields, gone. The people inside the second door had not seen a doctor since before the cross was painted. They were unlikely to see one before the cross came down, by whatever method it came down. What they did see 3 or 4 times a week was Margery. She handed the guard her token and he stepped aside, and she opened the door and she went in. The door of an actively shut-up house had a different feel from a house at the start of its quarantine. The early days had a smell that was bad but recent. The later days had a smell that had become part of the building. The wood absorbed it. The floors absorbed it. Linen that had been in the house for 2 weeks had absorbed it, whether it had been near anyone sick or not. Margery had walked in and out of houses at various stages of this process, and the second house was somewhere in the middle of the curve. The smell was not the worst she had encountered that summer. It was not the best either. She would have called out. We can say this with some confidence because it was the standard practice of parish nurses, recorded in several of the contemporary handbooks, to announce themselves on entering a shut-up house, partly so that anyone well enough to come down would know to come down, and partly so that anyone in distress would know that the small relief of a visit had arrived. The call would not have been loud. A nurse who had been visiting a household for 3 weeks knew the layout of the rooms and the sound of the voices that called back and the speed at which somebody moved on the upper floor when the floors were old and the joists creaked. Margery would have called in whatever the small phrase was that she and this household had settled into across her previous visits, and somebody on an upper floor would have answered or not answered, and she would have begun the work. The work in the middle of a long quarantine was different from the work at the start. At the start, the work was crisis. A household discovering that the cross had been painted on its door, food running out, fear at its peak. By the middle, the work had become routine in a way the beginning never was. The people still alive in the house had learned what their lives now consisted of. There was a person who was sick, or 2, in particular rooms. There was the daily question of who would eat and how much. There was the question of the chamber pots. There was the question of whether the linen could be changed and what would be done with what it was changed from. There was the question sometimes of whether a particular person was alive yet that morning. Margery had moved through all of these questions with this household for 2.5 weeks. She knew the answers that the household had settled on. She knew which of the people alive in the building wanted to talk and which did not. She knew which of them would meet her eyes and which would look away. She knew the names. The fact that we do not know the names does not mean she did not. There is a thing the histories of nursing care in the present century have learned, and that the parish nurses of 17th century London understood without anyone having written it down for them, which is that the central act of being in the room with a dying person is not, most of the time, anything dramatic. It is a series of small attentions, a cup held to a mouth at the right angle, a linen square wrung out so it is cool but not so cold it shocks the skin, the chamber pot taken away and brought back clean, a few words in a quiet voice when the person on the bed wants words, and silence when they do not. The work runs on a rhythm of small acts. The skill is in the rhythm. People who are not very good at the work either do too much or do too little. People who are good at it find the rhythm a particular sick person needs and stay with that rhythm for as long as it lasts. Whether Margery was good at it, we cannot say with certainty. But 7 payments in a season when most of her colleagues were dying are not the record of a person who was bad at it. The parish kept hiring her. The parish had options in principle. There were other women on the parish rolls. And the parish kept giving Margery the work. There is also the small matter of the churchwarden's added clause. In a book in which the same churchwarden was paying out hundreds of women that summer for the same kind of work, he singled out Margery once. Extraordinary pains. The phrase is parish bookkeeping language. It is not poetry, but it is the closest the surviving record comes to a contemporary judgment of how she did the work. And the judgment is positive. There is one thing about the second visit that the first visit could not have, and it is worth pausing on, because it does not have a polite contemporary parallel and is therefore easy to miss. In a city where the licensed doctors had fled, and the rich had fled, and the priests of many parishes had also fled, and the watchman sat outside the door rather than inside, and the family of a shut-up household had no way of leaving, the parish nurse was very often the only outside presence the household saw. For 2 or 3 weeks, for the duration of the quarantine, for however long it took to be over. Whatever happened in those rooms, she heard about it. Whatever the household needed from outside, she carried in. Whatever the family wanted said to anybody in the world beyond the door. The relative they were worried about, the debt they were leaving, the small final sentence they wanted carried to a child of theirs in the country. She was the one who could carry it. The role was not in any handbook. The handbooks listed the duties as fetching, watching, providing. The role exceeded the duties. People who have done end-of-life care in the present century, particularly the people who have done it in hospital settings during pandemic restrictions, when families were not allowed in and the staff at the bedside were the only humans the dying patient saw, would recognize the shape of what Margery was doing on the second visit on the 10th of July. The shape is the shape of being the one in the room when nobody else can be there. It is an ancient shape. It has been performed by women mostly in most of the centuries in which it has existed, and it has been paid for badly when it has been paid for at all, and the people who do it have not generally been famous, and the records of their work have not generally been kept. Margery stayed in the second house for somewhere between 1 and 2 hours. We are guessing at the duration. We are not guessing at the fact that she stayed. When she came out, the guard looked up. She nodded. He nodded. She picked up her white stick. The lane outside had filled with the heavier afternoon air of a midsummer day in the city, and the heat from the upper stories had begun to settle down between the buildings, and the smell of 3 shut-up houses on a single short lane had nowhere to go in the still air. She walked back toward Tothill Street and turned west and began the longer walk that would take her past the open ground of Tothill Fields on the way back to the small quarter where she lived. Tothill Fields in the summer of 1665 was an open piece of ground southwest of the Abbey, at the edge of where Westminster's built-up streets gave way to the wetter, rougher land that ran down towards the river marsh. The field had been used for a number of things over the centuries: a fairground in the medieval period, a place for occasional drilling of militia in the 16th century, a piece of common pasture in years when the parish needed somewhere for the city's last few cows to graze. By the 17th century, the most consistent use had become burial. Westminster had buried plague dead at Tothill before in earlier outbreaks. It had buried Scottish prisoners there after the Battle of Worcester in 1651. More than 1,000 of them in pits the parish had paid 67 cartloads of soil to cover. The field had been a place of mass burial in the institutional memory of the parish for at least 2 generations. By the time the cross went up on the door of the second house, Margery was visiting that summer. She turned onto the track that ran along the north edge of the field a little after 3. Her route home did not strictly require her to pass the field. She could have taken the longer street that curved further north and avoided the open ground entirely. Most of the women on the parish nursing rolls did take the longer street when they had the choice, because the smell of the field was easier to skirt than to walk through. Margery, on the 10th of July, took the short route. We do not know why. The short route saved perhaps 10 minutes and cut about a quarter mile from her walk, and a person who had been on her feet since before dawn might choose 10 minutes for any number of reasons that the ledger does not preserve. The field that afternoon was not what it would become. It would become catastrophic only later in the season, when the plague pits were being opened almost daily, and the parish bearers were carrying bodies through the night to keep up. In early July, the pace was still measured. 2 new pits had been opened that month, both on the south side of the field where the ground was firmer. Each pit was about 12 feet long and 9 feet wide, and somewhere between 7 and 10 feet deep. And the spoil from the digging had been mounded along the edges, and a thin layer of lime had been spread over the bottom of each pit before the first bodies went in. Lime was applied as a precaution against contagion and as a measure against smell, and the parish had instructions from the College of Physicians on the recommended thickness of the layer. The instructions were not generally followed. Lime was expensive. The parish had begun by the second week of July to economize on it. The instructions called for a thick layer. The parish was applying a thin one. Margery walked along the track with the pit visible to her left and downwind, which was the wrong wind for her purposes, and she walked at the steady pace of a person who had decided not to speed up, because speeding up would have changed nothing. The field was empty of workers at that hour. The bearers came at night. The gravediggers had been at the pits in the morning and would return in the evening. Between shifts, the field belonged to whoever was passing through it, which most of the time meant nobody, because most people had stopped passing through it. The pit she was nearest to had been opened about 10 days earlier. By the 10th of July, it held somewhere between 80 and 100 bodies, in layers with thin scatterings of lime between the layers, and a covering of soil over the topmost bodies that had been laid down hastily and was already settling. It was not a pretty piece of earthwork, even by the standards of plague pit construction. It would not be the worst pit Tothill Fields would see that summer. By September, the pits at this field would be deeper, longer, and refilled in shifts that ran around the clock, and the smell from the field would carry several streets in any direction the wind chose to take it. Each of the bodies in the pit had been processed, before burial, by a particular kind of parish worker whose name now would surprise most listeners, and whose work, in 1765, produced the numbers that historians have argued about ever since. The workers were called searchers. They were almost always women. They were almost always old. They were almost always poor. chosen in most parishes from the rolls of the parish pensioners, on the same logic that made the parish nurses come from the parish poor. The searcher's job was, in principle, simple. When somebody died in the parish, the searcher was sent for. She came to the house, looked at the body, asked whatever questions she needed to ask of the surviving family, and made a determination about the cause of death. The cause she named was reported to the parish clerk. The parish clerk passed it up to the Worshipful Company of Parish Clerks, and the company aggregated all of the parish reports into the weekly Bill of Mortality that the city read on Friday mornings. The system was the only system the city had for tracking the disease. The searchers were the system's instruments. The numbers in the Bills of Mortality, the numbers that historians have used for 3.5 centuries to estimate the death toll of the plague year, were generated, week by week, by old women looking at bodies in poor people's houses and writing causes onto small pieces of paper. The system had a bug. The bug was that a finding of plague triggered the shut-up rule. If the searcher reported plague, the dead person's house was nailed shut, with the surviving members of the family inside, for 40 days from the most recent death. If the searcher reported something else, fever, spotted fever, surfeit, the rising of the lights, any of the more ambiguous causes that a poor London household could plausibly produce, the house was not shut up. The family stayed free. The family kept its livelihood. The family did not have to watch the cross go up on its door. The searchers who lived in the same parishes as the families they were assessing knew this. The families knew it too. A small economy of bribes grew up around the searcher's verdict. A coin pressed into a hand could turn plague into spotted fever. A bottle of small beer, a piece of bread, a promise of future favour. The histories that have studied the searcher records of the plague year find traces of these transactions throughout, in the unexplained shifts in cause of death distribution that appear in some parishes and not others, in the wills and complaints that occasionally surface from the period. The searchers were repeatedly accused of dishonesty by educated men of the period. The accusation was true. The searchers were dishonest. They were dishonest in particular ways, in particular directions, and for particular reasons. They were also very often the only thing standing between a poor family and a 40-day death sentence, and the dishonesty in question was the small mercy of giving a different name to a death that was about to ruin the survivors. The numbers in the Bills of Mortality, which the city read every Friday with such intensity, were the numbers a network of poor old women had decided, in private kitchens, that the city was going to be told. There is a version of this fact that gets told in modern accounts as a scandal, as a story about how the 17th century could not count its dead. The version is not wrong. The plague death toll for the year was almost certainly significantly higher than the official figure of 68,000, possibly as high as 100,000. And the gap between the two numbers is partly the gap between what the searchers reported and what they could have reported if they had been willing to put more families into shut-up houses. The version is also incomplete. The numbers were political. The number that gets reported in a public health crisis has always been political. The number that the Bill of Mortality printed on a Friday in 1665 was a number shaped by the choices of the women who walked between the houses with their parish papers, and who knew, when they wrote the cause down, exactly what the cause was going to do to the people living in the room they had just left. It is a thing worth remembering when a contemporary reader looks at a plague year graph and sees a clean line. Margery walked past the pit at her own pace. She would have known the women who searched the dead in St. Margaret's. She might have walked to a parish gathering with one of them. The searcher and the nurse were adjacent professions in the parish economy of the disease, and the parish drew them from the same small population of poor older women, and the practitioners of one trade often knew the practitioners of the other by name. Whatever Margery thought of the searchers, she would have understood what they did and why, in the way that people who do badly paid difficult work understand the people doing the badly paid difficult work next to them. The track ran along the field for about 300 yards before it bent west toward Tothill Street. The smell thinned as she got further from the pit. The wind, at that point in the afternoon, was not strong but was steady, and it was carrying the field's air toward the river rather than toward the city, which was a small grace that would not last past sunset. Margery turned the corner. The field went out of her sight. 351 years later, in 2016, archaeologists working on the Crossrail tunnel through the City of London opened a different plague pit. This one a few miles east of Tothill Fields, in an old churchyard near Liverpool Street Station. The pit had been dated to the 1665 outbreak by the pottery buried alongside the bodies. The archaeologists removed 42 skeletons in total. Dental samples from 20 of those skeletons were sent for laboratory analysis. 5 returned positive results. The genetic signature of Yersinia pestis present in the teeth. The first direct biological confirmation that the disease the 17th century had called plague was, indeed, the same bacterium that had caused the Black Death 3 centuries earlier. The laboratory returned positive results for 5 of the samples. The genetic signature of Yersinia pestis present in the teeth. The first direct biological confirmation that the disease the 17th century had called plague was, indeed, the same bacterium that had caused the Black Death 3 centuries earlier. During the same Crossrail excavation on the surface of the disturbed ground, the archaeologists found a broken stone slab that had once been a headstone. The name carved into it was Mary Godfrey. The date was September 1665. The headstone was no longer over the grave it had originally marked. 3.5 centuries of churchyard reuse had separated it from whoever it was made for. But the name had survived, and the name belonged to a girl from the Cripplegate area of the city, recorded in the parish registers of that quarter as a plague victim of the catastrophic September of that year. The ground that Margery walked past on the 10th of July had not been examined by archaeologists and may never be. Tothill Fields was built over in the centuries that followed in stages, and most of the field is now under the streets and buildings of southwest Westminster. The bodies are still there. The pits that took them in were never properly closed in the modern sense. The lime did its work imperfectly. The bones are below the pavement. They have not been read. Margery would not have known any of this. She knew the field. She knew what the field was for. She walked past it on a hot afternoon in July and continued home, and the field continued behind her, and the pit she had passed nearest to was already, by that hour, beginning to be added to for the day's second time. The lane she lived on was already in shadow when she got back to it, the upper stories of the houses opposite her own throwing their shade across the cobbles a little after 4 in the afternoon. Westminster's poorer streets were laid out in such a way that most of them lost the sun by mid-afternoon in summer, which the people who lived on them counted as one of the few small advantages of their arrangement. A street in shadow held the day's heat less stubbornly than one in full sun. By the time Margery turned the last corner, the air on the lane was a few degrees cooler than the air she had been walking through for the past hour. And the relief was immediate, the way relief from heat always is when it has been earned by walking. She set the white stick against the inside wall, where it would stay for the rest of the day. She closed the door behind her and put the small bag down. She took off the wide cloth that she had worn over her shoulders all afternoon and hung it on a peg. She took off the apron, which she would wash in the morning. She poured a little water from the jug on the table into a shallow earthenware bowl, and she washed her hands and her face and her forearms with the deliberation of a person who had been doing this several times a day for weeks. And she did it for as long as it took. And then she dried her hands on a piece of linen kept for the purpose and hung the linen back on its hook. There was bread on the table that she had bought on the way home, a small dark loaf from one of the 2 bakeries that were still operating on Tothill Street. There was a piece of cheese left over from the morning, somewhat sweated by the day's heat, but still edible. There was a jug of small beer she had filled from the parish standpipe 2 streets over, which the parish was keeping running for the use of pensioners that summer, in a season when many of the private wells had been closed or were uncertain. She cut the bread. She sat at the table. She ate. The work of eating, like the work of the day, ran on a small set of practiced motions. The small purse with the morning's coins in it was on the table beside her. She would have counted them once before putting them away. She would have known from the count how much of the next week's expenses they covered. The arithmetic of a parish-poor budget was the kind of arithmetic that a working-class woman in 17th century London did in her head several times a day without writing anything down, because writing down the budget would have required a piece of paper that was itself part of the budget. The numbers stayed in her head. The numbers stayed in many people's heads for centuries, and almost none of those mental ledgers have come down to us, which is part of the reason the surviving paper ledger of a parish like St. Margaret's is the single most important kind of record we have for this period. The light through her one window had gone the colour that London's evening light goes in July when there is no rain in the forecast, and the haze from the city's chimney smoke has settled in. It was not exactly golden. It was a thinner, slightly grey warm light, the colour of a candle behind a paper shade. It would last for about another 2 hours before fading down to dark. Margery had no reason to light her candle yet. The bread and cheese and beer needed no candle. She ate without one. Across the river, in a room she did not know and would not have been able to imagine, a man named John Allin was sitting at his own small table that afternoon, working on a letter. Allin was an unlicensed physician, a man who had once been a Church of England minister, who had been ejected from his living 3 years earlier in the political reorganisations that followed the Restoration, and who now made his money by treating sick people in Southwark, on the south side of the Thames, in a 2-room lodging whose rent he could just barely cover. He had stayed in London through the spring and summer because he could not afford to leave, the same way Margery had stayed for the same reason. He was writing that summer to a friend named Philip Frith in the small Sussex town of Rye. He wrote letters every few weeks, and the letters survived, and they are now held in the East Sussex Record Office, and they are one of the most useful first-person accounts we have of what the plague summer felt like from inside the city, day by day. The line from Allin's letters that historians quote most often was written in August, a few weeks after the day Margery walked home, but the quality of life it describes was already in place by mid-July. Allin wrote that he was, by mercy, still well, in mid-dest of death, with the disease approaching nearer and nearer to his door, and a plague pit visible from the window of his chamber, open daily within view. The 2-room lodging, the chamber window, the daily view of the pit, these were the conditions under which he wrote. Allin and Margery were not in each other's lives in any way that any record reflects. He was in Southwark, she was in Westminster. He was an educated man, a minister by training, with a hand that wrote a steady letter in a clear period script. She was a parish poor roll pensioner, almost certainly unable to write her own name. He was watching the plague from a window. She was walking into it through doors. Their working days had almost no overlap. What they shared was a city, a summer, a refusal to leave that was made for both of them by their finances rather than by their courage, and the small quality of attention that the sustained presence of mass death produces in any human being who lives near it for long enough. What they also shared, although they could not have known it, was that the records of their summer would survive. Allin's letters, which his friend Frith preserved in a bundle that ended up in a country archive and was then catalogued in the 19th century and then transcribed in the 21st, are read now by historians who want to know what the plague city felt like to someone literate enough to write it down. The St. Margaret's Plague Book, which the parish closed at the end of the year and shelved and forgot, is read now by historians who want to know what the plague city felt like to someone who was paid to walk into the worst rooms in it. The two records describe overlapping experiences from very different angles. And like the diary of Pepys and the ledger of the parish, the picture they together produce is more complete than either is on its own. Margery did not know about Allin. Allin did not know about Margery. The history that knows about both of them is recent and small, and depends on a few historians having taken the trouble to read both kinds of document. The light in her room shifted further toward grey. She finished the bread. She put the cheese back into its cloth and tied it. She drained the last of the small beer. She would not eat again that night. There was nothing to do for the rest of the evening except wait for the light to go, and then sleep, and then get up, and then walk the same lanes again, and then come back. The next day, the 11th of July, would not be a payment day. She would not see the inside of the vestry. She would visit 2 of the houses on her current list, and possibly a 3rd if the parish added one, and she would walk past the field again on her way home. The day would be longer than she wanted it to be and shorter than her body could manage, and then it would be over, and the day after that would begin in the same way. There is a small modern recognition that fits the shape of an evening like Margery's, and it is worth naming carefully because it can easily slide into something it shouldn't be. The recognition is the particular quiet that settles around a person who has spent a working day doing something difficult that has not been seen by most of the people in their lives. The shape of the evening, the small meal, the small accounting of money against next week's expenses, the small attention to wash water and worn linen, is not unique to 17th century parish nursing. It belongs to a long tradition of working-class evenings in difficult work in many centuries, in many cities. Anyone who has ever come home from a hospital shift, from a care home, from a long day of cleaning rooms most people will never enter, will recognize the rhythm. The rhythm is not heroic. It is not even particularly sad. It is the rhythm of being a worker and being tired and getting ready to do it again. The candle on Margery's table stayed unlit. The window stayed open until just before she went to bed, when she closed the shutters against the slight chance of the evening air carrying something she did not want in the room. She slept. The St. Margaret's bell rang the next morning at 5, the way it had rung that morning, the way it had rung every morning of her life that mattered. She was awake before the first stroke. The St. Margaret's Plague Book stayed open on the churchwarden's table for the rest of that summer, and through the autumn, and through the early part of the winter that finally brought the disease down in numbers small enough that the parish could begin to think about something other than its dead. The book added entries through August, when the city's weekly death toll passed 7,000 and the parish was burying more people each week than it had buried in any year of the previous half-century. It added entries through September, the catastrophic month, when the lanes Margery walked were running with carts at every hour. It added entries through October, when the cold weather began to slow the disease and the bells thinned out a little, and through November, when the rate of decline became unmistakable, and into December, when the parish was still paying nurses but in steadily smaller numbers, because there were fewer households left to nurse. Margery Stiffany's name appears in the book through the autumn. The seventh and last of her recorded payments comes in the late summer. After that, she vanishes from the plague accounts. She does not appear in the parish burial register for the rest of the year, which means she did not die. She was alive at the close of 1665. What she did between her last plague book payment and the end of the year, the records of St. Margaret's do not say. She may have continued nursing without the parish recording new payments because the budget had been reorganised. She may have gone back to whatever she had been doing before the plague arrived. She may have moved in with relatives in another parish. She may have done several of these things in succession. The traceable record stops. Whether she lived another year or another decade or another 30, the surviving documents have not so far told us. Lara Thorpe's research, which traced what could be traced about the parish nurses through the marriage register and the burial register and the rate books, found candidate matches for a few of the women in the plague book in the years that followed, but nothing definitive for Stiffany. Other historians may find more in time. The parish records of 17th century London have not been exhausted. There is still slow work to do in archives by people willing to do it. What can be said with certainty is that Margery Stiffany was one of a relatively small number of plague nurses who walked into shut-up houses in St. Margaret's in the spring and summer of 1665 and was still alive at the end of the year. The parish had paid out wages to 414 people across the year. The parish lost a significant fraction of them. The exact proportion has not been calculated because the bookkeeping conventions make a clean count difficult, but the deaths recorded against the names of nurses in the same book in which they had been paid run into the dozens. Margery was not in those entries. She had walked through the worst summer in the parish's living memory, into the houses where the disease was, and back out, week after week, and she had survived. She was one of many. The Plague Book of St. Margaret's is the record of one parish. London had 130 parishes that year, and most of them paid nurses in similar arrangements, and most of them kept similar books, and most of those books did not survive. The nurses who walked into shut-up houses across the city in 1665 numbered, on the most careful estimates available, in the low thousands. Their names are mostly lost. Their parishes mostly lost them. The work they did has been described in the surviving primary sources by people who did not understand it, and the corrected understanding has had to be assembled slowly by historians working in archives that very few people read. The historians working on this material are not many. Lara Thorpe completed the doctoral thesis at Royal Holloway in 2018, and the chapter that came out of it the following year remains the foundational study of plague nursing in St. Margaret's. Rachel Anderson at Durham is finishing the next major contribution, a thesis on plague workers in early modern England and Scotland, drawing on parish records from a much wider area than any previous study. Jeremy Bolton, over a long career, has produced the foundational work on the welfare systems of 17th century London parishes, which is the institutional context for everything Margery did. Margaret Pelling laid much of the groundwork for understanding the medical occupations of the urban poor. Rochelle Monkhoff did the same for the searchers. The list is short. The work continues. It happens in archives and in libraries, and in offices, and in the small hours in which doctoral students read difficult handwriting under desk lamps. It does not happen quickly, and it does not pay well, and the people doing it are not famous, and the resemblance to the subject of their research is not always lost on them. The shape of what they are doing when one of them notices an extraordinary woman in a parish book and decides she is worth a paragraph is the shape this channel exists to honour. The shape is the long-delayed reading of records that were waiting. The records were always there. The reading is what brings them forward. The lives in the records continue to exist in some form, as long as there are people willing to read. There is a thing it is worth saying near the end of this evening, in plain language, because the whole shape of what we have been doing depends on it. The history that gets remembered in any culture is the history that someone took the trouble to write down and that someone else took the trouble to read. The trouble of writing down for most of human history was taken by literate people in the upper third of their societies, and the trouble of reading for most of human history was also taken by literate people in the upper third of their societies, and the two troubles together produced the surviving record of who has lived. The people whose lives are not in the upper third, the parish poor, the field workers, the women who washed and nursed and sewed and walked, the men who carted and dug and watched and were paid by the day, show up in the surviving record only when somebody in the literate third had a reason to write them down. A churchwarden paying out wages had a reason. A magistrate hearing a deposition had a reason. A coroner recording a death had a reason. The lives of the unwritten majority survive in fragments, in the margins of documents kept for other purposes, and the fragments are read, when they are read, by historians willing to look for them. What the channel does is what those historians do, on a smaller and slower scale and for a different audience. It looks for the fragments. It reads them with care. It puts the named woman back into the room she was in on the day she was named, and lets the listener be in that room with her for a couple of hours, and then closes the room again and leaves the woman in the record where she was found. Margery Stiffany was paid 7 times in 1665 for nursing the plague-stricken in the parish of St. Margaret's, Westminster. The 7th payment came at the end of the summer. The first had come in May. The 7 entries in the book occupy, in total, about 2.5 inches of paper. The phrase added to the entry for the 10th of July occupies a single line, in a slightly slower hand than the surrounding lines. The book sits now on a shelf in the Westminster City Archives. It has been read in any sustained way by perhaps a dozen people in the 360 years since it was closed. It is a small record. It is the only record there is. The morning we have been walking through tonight was a Monday, and it ended with a tired woman in a small room eating bread and cheese without a candle lit. And the morning that followed it was Tuesday, and the Tuesday after that was another Monday, and so on through the summer. The bell at St. Margaret's still rings. The book is still there. She is still in it. Sleep well.